Asha Khan is a quiet, practical woman from a dusty riverside village who cleans lecture halls at a city university by day and studies in the evenings out of stubborn curiosity. When an arrogant calculus professor jokes that the simple woman from the corridor couldn't possibly solve a board problem, he calls Asha up to humiliate her. Instead, Asha answers in a way no one expected, folding calculus into the language of looms, riverbeds, and the way light maps across water. Her solution unsettles the campus hierarchy, opens buried grief, and forces everyone, most of all the professor, to reckon with what it means to know. The story is cinematic and intimate, following Asha and three central figures through humiliation, revelation, and small acts of courage, exploring themes of dignity, intuition versus credentialism, redemption, and the quiet power of being underestimated. The broom made a low, steady sound against the polished wood of Lecture Hall 3B, a sound that had threaded itself through Asha Khan's days for the last 3 years, early morning opening of windows, sweeping the remaining confetti and coffee grounds from exam season, the late night sweep after seminars dissolved into cigarette smoke and low, earnest arguments. Her hands knew every gouge in the floor, the way sunlight angled through the high windows at certain hours and left a warm rectangle that smelled faintly of chalk and summer. She kept time by the building's small, persistent rhythms, the bell at 8, the clatter of heels across the corridor at 10, and the hush before finals that sounded like the held breath of a body preparing to speak. People called her simple, in the way they might call a riverbank simple, not noticing that a riverbank is where everything accumulates. She salted rice for her brother, mended clothes at midnight under a kerosene lamp, and read mathematics textbooks by the light of a borrowed phone. She had no university degree and little patience for words like theory, when hands and habit carried so much knowledge. When the students laughed at lunch about woman like that, who swept and smiled without history, Asha smiled anyway. Some generosity, she had found, fit better in pockets than in proclamations. Professor Farid Malik was a man for whom the world had a precise, polished edge. He wore suits like flags and voice like the chalk he favored, sharp, decisive, and designed to draw attention. At 50, with hair going silver at the temples, he moved as if habit had smoothed away any possibility of surprise. He had been invited to guest lecture on advanced calculus, a set piece of elegance and authority. He liked, more than anything, the soft noise that followed when he placed a problem on the board. Scribble, the tapping of screens, the small rattle of self-satisfaction. His students learned fast to mimic awe. In the back of his mind, he kept a ledger of accomplishments and disappointments, and he treated people as items to be graded. Jokes landed like tests, harmless to some, sharp to others. Nor was a physics graduate student with hair tied up in a way that declared utility above everything else, and a laugh that always began with the eyes. She had taken a liking to Asha over months of passing her in the corridor, the two exchanging small daily truths. Noor's borrowed sandwiches, Asha's news of the river's rise. Noor had a soft anger at imbalances, at lectures where language hid as much as it revealed, at teachers who spoke down rather than up. She believed knowledge should be a door left open. Bilal was Asha's younger brother, a man whose hands were rough with factory oil and whose smile could shift off like a warm blanket. He had the sort of loyalty that made him staunch and stubborn. He had taught Asha to count at their mother's knee, then had been the one to push her toward the evening classes at the university when the factory fired him and the world narrowed. "Learn to count your own worth," he'd said. The first time he put money in her hand to pay a registration fee, he was protective in his own small way, and he carried with him the smell of diesel and cheap cologne. It was Noor who introduced Asha to calculus, offering to sit with her one evening after lecture, unraveling limit as if it were a filament of yarn. "It's about getting close," she said, pressing the book into Ash's lap. Close like the river comes to the bank, close as a stitch. Asha blushed at the metaphors, and liked them, because allegory had always been the loom of her life. Her mother had been a seamstress who told stories through patterns. The language of math, Noor suggested, was no different, patterns that iterated, scaled, and repeated until something whole emerged. Ash's first notebook had been a composition book with a frayed spine, the ink of early attempts smeared where she had thought too fast. She learned to see a derivative as the slope of a roof, an integral as the sum of a day's bread. She carried fragments of proofs in her pocket like talismans. People at the reception desk would pat her shoulder when she came in early and asked about office hours, like she was asking for directions to a park. They smiled with the practical kindness of people who make room for the constant, slow work of the world. The semester moved like a tide. Professor Malik's lecture on applied optimization was the sort of public theater the university staged to woo donors. The room was full, undergrads, postgrads, a few visitors, and the palpable hum of a dozen cell phones waiting to be baited with a striking quote. Malik's opening sentences were a blade. Well, honed, certain. He waxed about elegance and rigor, about how the disciplines separated the mind from common muddle. As he wrote a problem on the board, his hand cut through the air with the confidence of someone who knows that humiliation can be instructive. On the far edge of the room, sweeping a row of empty chairs, Asha worked without drawing attention. She had come early to finish so she could be home in time for Bilal's late shift. When Malik paused, looked toward the door, and then back to the class, his gaze grazed Asha like a cool wind. A faint smile spread across his face, the kind that belongs to people who appreciate a joke about someone else's inadequacy. Ah, he said, loud enough for the room to pick up the small sound. We have the campus's resident cleaner in attendance today. Tell me, Asha, if you are curious, come here. Solve this, he said, tapping the problem with a piece of chalk. Let us test whether simple and simple-minded are synonyms. The room tilted. Noor's mouth formed a small O. Students' phones lifted a degree. The phrase landed on Asha like a thrown pebble. Humiliation is cold at first, a tiny stone under the ribs. She had experienced it before. Late buses, market bargaining, the way people sighed when they had to lower themselves to speak with her. Her hands stilled. Bilal's voice in her head said nothing. He would be at the factory until midnight. The broom in her hand made a hollow sound. She wiped the floor with method and a calm that came from the many times she had chosen being invisible over being visible. And then she saw Noor's eyes, a pair of stubborn, luminous beacons. Noor's lips mouthy go. Asha set the broom against the chair and walked to the front of the room. Her feet knew the path between rows, and each step clicked on a floor scuffed with the small histories of previous battles. People watched as if watching a mismatch in a movie. Malik arranged his eyebrows into a question mark and cleared his throat theatrically. Professor? Asha said, when she reached the blackboard. Her voice was smaller than the sound of the projector but steady. Which part would you like me to solve? The class muttered. Asha studied the problem printed in Malik's strong, angular hand. Maximize the volume of a container formed by rotating the curve y-axis around the x-axis with given constraints. An optimization problem dressed in the gaudy suit of applied mathematics. It was a museum piece proof, a classic problem showcasing calculus of variations. Malik expected formalism, Euler, Lagrange, boundary conditions, and a performance of symbols. The room waited to see her fail. Asha felt the problem like texture there, curve like a river, rotation like the turning of a potter's wheel. She closed her eyes, and the memory came. The river in her village where her mother had stood to wring cloth against a stone. The cloth, when she wrung it, formed loops and drips that traced arcs. The weight of cloth tightened into a shape that water hugged. Her mother had spoken of shapes without numbers, eyeing the fall of fabric as if it read secrets. She drew. Not equations at first. No ribbons of symbols. Just a simple sketch, a curve, then a pale shadow of the shape it would make when spun. A circle was born at the edge, a cylinder at the center. Ash's wrist moved like the sweep of a loom, fingers coaxing line from surface. Noor watched like a concert pianist watching a practice student. Malik, smiling thinly, saw nothing but material for ridicule. Start with the physical, Asha said. Then, because the room required explanation in the professor's language, she folded the physical into words he'd understand. If you spin this curve, the volume is stacks of disks. Each disk is area pi y squared times a thin width. A ripple went through the room. It was the kind of ripple that begins not as shock, but as recognition. Any student who had done volumes of revolution nodded, because she had said what they knew. Malik's smile tightened. Perhaps he had expected her to fumble over the formalism. She continued, drawing small rectangles along the curve like stitches. But suppose the curve is not smooth, she said, thinking of the river-bathed stones, of how water would pool. Suppose the curve's height at a point is the result of many small gatherings of thread, stitches. When you sum a lot of small stitches, you make cloth. So to get a whole, you add many little discs. The best shape, she paused and looked at Malik, is the one that gives the best use of material. Now Malik's fingers tapped the chalk with a new sound, a careful detective's. Ash's method was not the standard flourish he taught. She wasn't citing a canonical general solution. Instead, she started with an everyday measure area from small slices. She spoke of approximations as if talking about sewing, how a long seam is made of small, repeated motions. Limits arrive naturally, not as symbolism, but as habit. You make the stitch smaller and smaller until the seam's shape is exact. She set up the integral in the form the class expected, but then she introduced an idea the professor had not seen since he had learned to lecture more than to listen: symmetry as economy. If the edges of the shape are equal, she said, then the weight that goes to the edges is like the extra threads on a hem. It adds up. It wants to spread. So the best shape spreads evenly. She wrote the variational functional, and instead of invoking the Euler-Lagrange theorem with ritual incantation, she derived it by arranging small terms, like beads on a string, and nudging one bead to see how the others changed. Students began to lean. Noor's jaw loosened. Her fingers twitched with the need to applaud. Malik, for all his armor, felt something like heat at the back of his neck. Here, in front of him, someone with no formal pedigree was following a principle he valued but had learned to cloak in pedagogy intuition shaped by the practical, translated into mathematics. When Asha reached the critical equation, she didn't announce, therefore, as textbooks do. She spoke of sufficiency. This shape gives the largest volume for the material, she said. If you traced it with thread, you would see it uses every bit without waste. A student in the third row, one who had stayed for office hours and whose eyes had a permanent crease of wonder, raised a hand. Are you using the catenary? He asked. Asha's mouth formed the word like someone tasting a foreign spice. I don't know the word, she replied, honesty like glass. But I know the river's answer. The class was silent then in a different way, not because someone had failed their attempt, but because someone had opened a door into a room they'd thought locked. Phones were forgotten. Professor Malik's smirk had melted into something more complicated. He moved back to the board, wanting to regain the stage, to translate her statements into formal finery. He wrote the Lagrangian and marched through stationary conditions. Then, with a crispness Asha had always admired and secretly feared, he recast her steps into the theorem he'd been trained to wield. He closed the circle for the audience, but the circle began and had been led by Asha's hands. When she walked back to the broom, Noor reached out and pressed Asha's hand, then found some small, clumsy phrase to say, you were brilliant. Brilliant. Asha repeated, tasting the word, unfamiliar like sugar in tea. It sat in her chest like a stone warmed by sunlight. Later, the students would argue about the moment for weeks. Some wrote posts with the kind of moral clarity that makes moral outrage easy to digest. A professor waves at the vulnerable. The vulnerable outshines him. Congratulations! Others, in the protective barrels of academia, whispered about protocol and the perils of anecdotal intuition. But in the days that followed, something else happened that the posts could not record. People came to the corridor with questions. The first was a male carrier whose son wanted to understand why a letter's envelope curved when a table edge caught it. A janitor asked about the best shape for a bucket. Noor, emboldened, asked Asha if she would help the university's outreach program to design simple demonstrations for village schools. You make teaching sensible, she said. You don't make it a tower. Professor Malik was a study in bruised pride. Alone in his office, he moved through the lecture as if through a ruined script. He could not deny the clarity of Asha's approach, nor could he easily accept the bruising lesson that knowledge sometimes appears outside his ledger domain. He had been trained to see his role as the keeper of standards, and Asha's presence undermined that. There were other things under the standard, too: a book review he had just been promised by an editor, a lecture tour whose image required him to stand as the archetype of authority. A crack in the facade was dangerous. Befuddled, he called a faculty meeting, and as people often do when their worldview creaks, he doubled down on the language of skill. We must preserve rigor, he said, using the same tidy words he'd used for years. Yet at night, when the world was quiet, he would find himself finding Asha's lines again and feeling the echo not as an affront, but as a necessary correction. He replayed her drawing of discs in the dark, fingers behind his neck, trying to learn how she had moved the room. Asha returned to her days like water finding its level, but the level had risen. The broom's cadence held new consonants. Students who had once ignored her now greeted her with awkward niceties. Bilal, surprised when she told him, laughed with a thick, startled pride that arranged itself into plans. They can't put you in a box, sister, he said, and his voice had the sharp edges of a man imagining a better life. We could open a small tutoring class after my shift. You can teach what you know. Asha cataloged the offers with the same indifferent kindness she used to collect lost pens at the reception desk. Her heart, which had become used to small rhythms, bread, work, bed, felt an unfamiliar clamor. She thought of her mother, who had sewn and hummed and never once been called brilliant. She thought of the river, and how it kept finding the path of least resistance, and how people, when given a new path, sometimes followed it. The next month, the university announced a small program pairing villagers with the mathematics department to solve practical problems. Noor insisted Asha lead the first workshop. Asha agreed because the idea of returning to the village with the smell of the river in her clothes felt like coming full circle. She did not think in terms of career. She thought in terms of use. Could knowledge help people hold more water? Could it help them shape a canal so that the grain, seed they planted would not drown when the monsoon came? They set up tables in the community hall. Asha, Noor, and a clutch of students brought chalk and coffee and a board. Villagers came with questions and with treasure, boxes of experience, measurements of the land, tales of failed experiments, the crooked pride of people accustomed to improvising survival. Children clustered at the edges, watching patterns like moths to a flame. Bilal, who had arrived in his oil-streaked factory uniform, sat at the back, arms folded, beaming. Asha taught by sewing metaphors and by counting beans. She showed them how to think of water as something that accumulates in small parts, like stitches in a hem. They sketched canals and rotated curves in the air with their fingers. They built models with clay and set them in bowls of water to watch how flow found paths, how narrowing a neck could choke a current or speed it, and how widening a basin could ease it. The students, who had been told to think of integrals as formalism, began to see them as tools that measured how to spread water across a field to make millet flourish. Word spread. The local press, hungry for human interest stories, came to film. The footage caught Asha teaching a small boy to approximate an area with pebbles and then letting the boy dump water over them to see how the water distributed itself. The video looped across phones and the university's social channel. In a swirl of commentary, people called Asha teacher, and the web coined nicknames that fit easily into emoji. Malik watched the clip and felt a weight he had not expected, not shame, exactly, but the slow surrender of a man whose sense of place had been altered. At first, he resisted. He drafted stern memos about appropriate engagement and consistency of pedagogy and sent them to the faculty secretary with this mechanical care he used to sign off grant reports. He expected agreement. Instead, a surprising number of colleagues wrote back with small notes, praise, or a memory of someone who had taught them with a plainness like ashes. Someone suggested inviting her to the academic circle. Someone else, the one who liked to puncture pomp with kindness, said, invite her to teach and prepare to be taught. When the provost asked Malik to host a roundtable on community pedagogy and asked if he would invite Asha as a speaker, the request felt to him like a request for a wound. He found himself writing and erasing an invitation. Too formal, too condescending, until, with a reluctant hand, he invited her as an equal, or at least as a guest. He told himself it was for optics. He told himself many small things to keep the narrative steady. On the day of the roundtable, the university's circular hall filled with an unusual mixture of donors and blue-colored workers, academics, and the family of a woman who once mended gowns behind stage sets. Asha wore a simple shawl, embroidered by her mother before she died, a pattern of small interlocking diamonds. When Malik introduced her, his voice faltered on the word speaker, as if it were unfamiliar to be used for her. He recited her small biography in the language of cetaceans, cleaner, now community educator. He felt the sentences land like pebbles in a pond. Asha walked to the podium as if walking to the well for water. Behind her, the hall hummed with the expectation of transformation. She did not read a script. She spoke of the river and how, when she was small, people would lay out cloth on the banks and wait for the tide to make patterns. She spoke about how school taught students to chase the elegant theorem without noticing the bread on the table. I learned calculus because my hands learned to measure, she said. My mother learned shapes by the way her needle caught the cloth. When you look with both eyes, hands and mind, the world becomes less dangerous. It was not a polemic but a story, as luminous as a lantern. She took the audience through a day's work, sweeping the hall, noticing a smudge pattern on a window that looked like a Gaussian curve, bringing that pattern into a class with a child who had asked why the cloud in the sky looked like it had edges. The people in the front rows leaned forward. Donors whose lives were cataloged in spreadsheets thought of their gardens and the drainage issues they'd ignored. The university's PR director, who had once written press releases as if they were spells, scribbled the word authentic, as if it might cure a department. After the talk, people clustered. For once, the faculty's conversations were not about tenure or funding, but about the quality of listening. Malik found himself in a queue of sorts. People who wanted to praise, to apologize indirectly, to ask for more. When he reached Asha, he had something more than pity or pride. He had a quiet trepidation. You were, I mean, he began. He had the sudden thought of the river again, of how it could both erode and create. You have a way of seeing. He stopped. Pride can keep a man from finishing sentences. Now he finished. I would like to learn how you teach. Asha looked at him. In her face was the patience of someone who had mended clothes with uneven thread and knew that stitches do not need to be identical. Then come to the village, she said simply. Come before the rains. Bring questions. He did, against his own expectations and with an internal script that kept tripping him. Malik traveled to Ash's village with a notepad and a few technical instruments that felt clumsy in his hands. The village was a longer distance than he had imagined. The road, a line of light cutting through fields, and the smell of wet earth. Children ran out to look at the car like they were offered a new toy. Ash's house was small, the walls a patterned college of memories. Her brother welcomed him with the kind of directness only those who have risked together can muster. They went to the river at dawn. Asha led him to a bend where reeds grew thick and the water's movement made soft music. Watch, she said, and she pushed a stick into the bed. Malik, schooled in formal observation, recorded velocity numbers and took frames of video. Asha stood with her hands clasped and watched the water make patterns around the stone like a lover going around a spouse. You measure too quickly, she said eventually, not unkind. You think numbers come before noticing. He had to admit that the notation in his notebooks, for all its precision, omitted things like the smell of damp leaves and the way light pools at the edge. Those things, he realized, mattered because they had consequences: where the fish nested, where a foot would slip, where a grain might sit in mud and rot rather than germinate. Together, they mapped a small irrigation solution. Malik contributed the equations about head loss in pipes and the efficiency of flow. Asha translated those into simple instructions the villagers could enact using bamboo and cord. They built a model from clay and cans, spilling water over it with the kind of laughter that comes when people find the joy of invention. The canal they designed saved a row of millet from potential ruin that season. A small victory, but in a place built by many small hands, victory multiplies. The publicity that followed was not the kind that conquers continents. It was local and rich and human, a festival in which the villagers put garlands on both Asha and Malik, an acceptance that shimmered like a river at noon. Malik felt changes inside him that no memorandum could record. There was embarrassment, yes, regret for his earlier attitude, but there was something softer, a humility that made space. He began to hold his lectures differently, to ask questions before he proclaimed answers, to bring students to the field, to watch water behave, rather than only to show them formulae. Ash's life adjusted as well. She started tutoring evenings at the community center, with Noor and Bilal occasionally dropping in to help with logistics, bringing tea and sandwiches. Families came with practical problems: how to measure the slope on a small roof to collect rainwater, how to build a trough that wouldn't leak, how to estimate how many sacks of grain would fit in a storage room. Asha taught them to see functions as habits and graphs as maps of their daily labor. There were obstacles. People who had positioned themselves as gatekeepers to knowledge grumbled about oversimplification and populism. Asha, not interested in academic battles, kept her answers straightforward. When a skeptical official asked for data, she provided models and demonstrations rather than papers. When donors wanted a flashy center, she recommended modest classrooms and water-conserving trenches. She had an instinct for use, an authenticity that refused to be coated in veneers. The real climax, for Asha, was not a public triumph, but a quiet reconciliation with a ghost. One afternoon, after the monsoon had left the fields shimmering and the channel steady, she returned to the river and found her mother's old sewing box beneath the house, wrapped in oilcloth and thyme. Inside were scraps of faded calico and the small tools of a life stitched to its work. She sat on the bank and opened it, and the sound of the river filled what was left of the long day. She would have liked to see this. Bile said beside her, voice steady like a boat's oar. He had come with a thermos and 2 cups. He sat and watched the water. She'd say you always understood shapes. Asha laughed softly. She would not have been surprised. In the weeks and months after, the university adjusted. Malik, once a man who reserved praise for formal attainment, learned the discipline of appreciation. He spoke at conferences about community, engaged learning, and used Asha's example not as a matter of sensationalism, but as practice. He revised syllabi to include a fieldwork component. He made space in his schedule to be interrupted by simple questions. Students wrote essays about the ripple effect of humility. Asha never sought titles. She taught because she liked the look in a child's eyes when something clicked, because she liked seeing water find its path and seeds find earth. The world, she had learned, offered many ways of knowing. Some arrived, wrapped in diplomas, some in weathered hands. The important thing was to heed what worked. When the university awarded a small community prize to the outreach program, Malik presented it to the group. He handed the plaque to Asha with stiff fingers. The room stood to applaud. Asha felt the applause like sunlight. She thought of the broom, propped in the back of her mind, like an old friend, waiting for her to return. She had not left the broom. She still swept the lecture halls sometimes, and she still mended shirts in the evenings. But she had added other tools to her life: chalk, models, a chalkboard marked with a child's impatience to ask why. After the ceremony, Malik lingered. The public part had finished, but there are always private parts. He looked older in the light, the edges of his face had softened. "Do you forgive me?" he asked, the question almost a child's. Asha considered the man who had asked her as a joke and had been disarmed by the depth of a river. She thought of his colleagues, of how hard it is to change the shape of a life once it has been carved. Forgiveness, she knew, was not a single act, but a practice. She smiled, because she had learned that smiling is a kind of generosity that makes the future harmless. "I don't know about forgiving," she said. "I know only that the water keeps moving, and it will find its way if we make a good channel." He laughed, a sound like an exhale that had been held too long. They walked out together into the afternoon, books and broom, and the smell of fresh, cut grass in the air. Students pressed past, talking and arguing, light on their faces. Noor waved from a table where children were trying to build a dam. Bilal waved from the doorway, hands still smelling faintly of oil. Asha felt the world had expanded not because the university had changed but because she had found a new way to stand in it. She had come to the city to sweep floors and to study the margins. In answering a professor's joke with the river's patience, she had not claimed the lecture hall as a throne but as another room to keep. She had shown, in a way that could not be undone by papers or posts, that knowledge held its power when it served people, and that the kind of intelligence that could coax water from a place of stubborn fort was a form of brilliance in its own right. In the years that followed, students would remember the day a simple woman solved a calculus problem. Some would tell it as a cautionary tale about humility, others as a parable about the blindness of authority. Asha would say only this when asked, "I solved what I saw. That's all." And as the river rose and fell beyond the campus walls, she would slip her hand into the pocket of her shawl and feel the familiar shape of a small stone, warmed by the sun. An ordinary thing, keeping steady in a world that liked to call itself vast.